I've personally seen 930 species or so of moths in Oklahoma.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BioBlitz Oklahoma podcast. I am Priscilla Crawford, co-coordinator of BioBlitz Oklahoma and a conservation biologist with the Oklahoma Biological Survey. This podcast is an extension of our BioBlitz Oklahoma events. Now we can celebrate Oklahoma's biodiversity with you all year round. In these podcasts, we will chat with our biodiversity experts, answer biodiversity questions, and let you know about biodiversity and community science opportunities that you can join. In this Meet the Expert episode, I chat with Zach DuFran, who has been our moth expert for the past couple years at BioBlitz. Zach is our first podcast guest that is one of our amateur experts. I mean, his day job is something totally different from biology. The term amateur is in no way reflective of his expertise, and he has become one of the most knowledgeable moth biologists I know. Join me as we talk about his self-taught journey to learning all about moths and seeing nearly 1,000 moth species in Oklahoma.
Hi, my name is Zach DuFran, and I am a computer scientist at the National Weather Service Radar Operations Center in Norman, Oklahoma.
Welcome, Zach, to our BioBlitz Oklahoma podcast. I'm so glad that you are here with me today to talk about your background and your love of moths. You are our first guest that is our amateur expert. And by amateur, I don't mean to say any less knowledgeable. In fact, that's quite the opposite. I simply mean that biology isn't your day job, which you just stated. I love that at BioBlitz and other community science projects such as iNaturalist, it doesn't matter if your money-making profession is something different. What matters is your love of nature and your interest in learning more about our natural world. Honestly, I know a fair number of professional biologists that barely seem to be interested in going outside to watch organisms, and some would be hard-pressed to be able to identify many species. However, you are able to identify many species of one of our most elusive and cryptic groups of organisms. You have been participating in BioBlitz Oklahoma for the last few years and have become our moth expert for both our fall and spring events. How did you hear about our BioBlitz event?
I think I got on an email list for maybe the Department of Wildlife Conservation and first heard about BioBlitz that way. And it was just before April of 2017. And I was like, oh, this sounds like fun. I think I had already downloaded the iNaturalist app and used it a few times and had liked it. And so I'm like, I'm going to do this, for a full month. I'm going to see how many species of things I can find. And at that time, I wasn't really interested in moths, but that's what kicked off my interest in moths, was using iNaturalist during that month, just trying to identify and see as many organisms, living things in the state of Oklahoma as I could. I, did a lot of plants, and I was noticing, leaving my porch light on in the evening, that a lot of insects were arriving, and they were new insects every night, and specifically a lot of moths. I kept doing it throughout the month of April, and whenever the BioBlitz, the virtual BioBlitz ended at the end of April, I was like, I think I'm just going to keep doing this. Kept leaving my porch light on every night. The rest is history. I got hooked, and I just couldn't stop doing it.
So it was actually that BioBlitz virtual event that inspired you to start learning about moths?
Yeah, it was. Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Well, that's a great story. We inspired you.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think I stalked you that first virtual BioBlitz because you and I both live in central Norman. And in iNaturalist, you can look at the observations via a map. And I was scrolling around my neighborhood that year, and I noticed a few blocks south of my street that a huge cluster of observations popped up. And I was like, who is this? I really need to get to know this person. So I guess I've been stalking you since 2017 when I saw you pop up in my neighborhood in the iNaturalist.
Yeah, it's funny. iNaturalist is neat from that perspective, and you can see what other observations are being made in your area or, far away too. During that BioBlitz, I was noticing other people in my area as well. I remember Emily Marlson was making a lot of observations in Norman. And so I had kind of this little silent competition that I was, trying to keep up with Emily and see things that she was seeing. And it was exciting to see what else was being observed in our area here in just central Oklahoma at that time of year.
Yeah, and I think some of the competition isn't quite so silent during our virtual BioBlitz. There's some significant competition, I think, amongst some of our BioBlitzers up in Tulsa who work together. They have some personal competition going on during our virtual BioBlitz event in April. So you started learning about moths only just a few years ago, and it was because you left your light on and saw this huge diversity. So I guess you've been mostly self-taught. How did you learn so much on your own?
Yeah, that's right. It's just been a couple of years, mainly just through observations, taking pictures, and then spending a lot of time after that trying to identify what I had seen, either looking at Bug Guide, the website, or Moth Photographers Group website. I did buy the Peterson Field Guide to Moths of Southeastern North America, which is pretty good. It's not comprehensive because there's way too many species to put all in one field guide. But it does give you a good idea. You see a moth and you can find something that looks really similar in the book, even if you can't find that exact species, and you're in the right family. And so I've gotten to where I'm more interested now in some of the life history, learning deeper about the species that I've seen, what their caterpillars look like, and what host plants they use.
Oh, yeah.
Even kind of like seasonality of some moths. There's definitely some early spring moths and some late fall moths. I've had a few species on my porch light for the last month, whereas there's not very many species out right now, but the ones that I have are like late fall moths that I wouldn't see the rest of the year. That's something I didn't know even a year ago.
And moths are a group that is typically neglected by naturalists. The majority of the species of the order Lepidoptera. So moths make up most of that order. And then butterflies are just a very small group actually within there. And if I have my phylogeny correct, butterflies are just like a small group within moths. They're like kind of specialized moths. I think a lot of people probably want to know what the difference is. Do you have a good rule of thumb of what you say is a moth versus a butterfly?
Most people, the common sort of things you think about are butterflies are pretty and moths are dull looking. And that's not a very good definition, really, when it comes down to it.
No.
So there's not a strong distinction between butterflies and moths. Butterflies and moths all belong to Lepidoptera. And there are like a couple of families that we call butterflies. And then all of the other families are moths. The easiest way to tell them apart usually is the antenna. Most butterflies have kind of a little club or a ball at the end of the antenna. That includes the skippers and, the swallowtails and all the other butterflies we're familiar with. And moths either usually have straight antenna without a club at the end, or they have kind of feathery antenna. There are exceptions to that. There's a couple of butterflies that don't have a club, and there's a couple of moths that do. By far, that's the best way to tell them apart.
Yeah, as in the case of most of biology, there are exceptions to all of the rules. And some people think of moths being at night versus during the day, and there are lots of exceptions to that. You mentioned something that you learned recently about the seasonality. Are there things that you're learning recently that have been really interesting for you as well?
The seasonality and host plants are really interesting to me. There are a few species that will eat anything as caterpillars, or not anything, but they'll eat a large variety of plants as caterpillars. Majority of species are going to have a specific species or genus or family of plants that they're going to be interested in eating. I think most people are well aware that the monarch butterfly needs milkweeds. Well, that's true of almost any species of butterfly or moth. They're going to be targeting a specific species or group of plants that they need to raise their young on. To me, I think it's really interesting, and it's kind of pulls in all of ecology. It brings in my interest in native plants and other things and birds, because in some ways they're a bedrock of the food system, and that the caterpillars are going to feed birds and they're going to be propagating plants through pollination. And so they're kind of like this cog in this really important cog in any ecological system. And I like learning about all those different connections.
Yeah, I think I heard a statistic just recently about how many caterpillars it takes to make one successful like chickadee fledgling. And it was over 1,000 caterpillars were needed to feed one chickadee to reach maturity and fledge out of the nest. Yeah, like you said, they're very important ecologically, and they can be also a pest too. A lot of moth caterpillars have been known to be pests, but we won't go there. Before COVID, and everything got shut down and we couldn't have public events, you were holding a lot of moth nights around the state that were open to the public. What got you started offering these events for people?
Well, so I mentioned that I started at my porch light. I also set up a light in my backyard and pointed at a sheet. To a certain extent, limited in my own backyard as to how many species I would see and the variety of plants that are around. And I also knew that the plants that were growing in my backyard are not really representative of the native environment, the natural environment in Oklahoma prior to humans arriving.
Right, because we live in the middle of a town.
I kind of wanted to get outside of town a little bit and see what species would show up. So actually in 2017, I had been talking to a couple other people that had participated in BioBlitz that had been observing some moths. And I was like, should we do a moth night sometime? Because I've heard about these. These can be kind of fun, set up sheets and lights. And luckily enough, I have a family member with land out by Lake Thunderbird in East Norman, and asked them if I could go out there and set up some lights and plug into their electricity. And they said, sure, do whatever you'd like. I set up one night and had a couple people join me. And it went well, and I decided to do it again. Our first one actually was during National Moth Week, which is the last week of July every year.
Oh, perfect.
We registered it as one of the official events.
Oh, nice.
I enjoyed it so much, and every time I went out there, I would see different things. And so I kind of just started doing it regularly. I connected with more people on iNaturalist that were observing moths at their homes. Got a pretty good group of friends now that want to do it regularly when it's warm, which is, moth season is kind of like mid-March through October. Mm-hmm. And we've been trying to do it like every 2 weeks. Even during COVID, we've just kept our group small and worn masks, tried to socially distance as much as possible. We've recorded a lot of species out at that one area by Lake Thunderbird.
Yeah, and I was really thankful that you offered a moth night during our BioBlitz event this fall. And in fact, we went to that location at Lake Thunderbird for our moth night during that BioBlitz weekend. And although it was kind of cool and chilly, and I left early when you said before all the cool moths came out, you did see quite a few species that night, didn't you?
We did. It was a little cooler than I would have liked. Early in the season and late in the season, you really want to target the warm days. But since we had scheduled that one ahead of time, we kind of just had to go with it. I think we saw around 40 species, which is a low count for us because during the middle of the summer, on our good nights, we always had over 100 species, lots of times around 150.
Wow.
Man, it's just pretty incredible to see that many species within one order of Lepidoptera in an evening. Usually we'd start around sunset and go until midnight, sometimes later.
How many species have you seen at that one site at Thunderbird, like total? Have you kept a list?
I have. Well, I kind of use iNaturalist mostly for that purpose. It becomes cumbersome to try to do that on paper or even in a spreadsheet. But since I'm taking photographs and uploading them there anyways, I use the tools on there to search. It's over 600 species, I know.
Oh, wow.
At that location. I've personally seen 930 species or so of moths in Oklahoma. Even with that many that I've seen, there's still a lot left. I'm maybe have gotten about halfway through the number of known species in Oklahoma. So there's a lot left to see.
So when do you think you'll break 1,000?
Oh, next summer. I added more than 100 this year, I know. So sometime next summer, I'll probably reach 1,000.
So during this kind of COVID time, did you have more time to do moth stuff because there weren't, family activities to have to go to and those sorts of things? Were you able to get outside more often?
Yeah, I was, because I wasn't sitting in one place 8 hours a day and could get up and take breaks and things. That was helpful. And also because I could stay up later because I didn't have to start working at a certain time in the morning.
Oh, yeah.
That was useful. I don't know about my fellow moth buddies that showed up to the moth nights and was wondering why I was doing on a Wednesday night and staying up until 2 a.m. But anyway, I think we all had a good time, and, we were okay to be a little sleepy the next day. It was worth the sacrifice.
So you mentioned that you use iNaturalist, and of course I've seen you use iNaturalist regularly during my stalking period. Is that the way you primarily record your observations?
I also make use of an app called LEPS by Field Guide, and I've found that the AI image recognition on there is sometimes better than iNaturalist in that it seems that there's maybe a little less of a geographic weight. On iNaturalist, lots of times you won't get a suggestion when you see something that hasn't been seen within your state before because it's thinking that maybe is not likely where you are.
Oh, yeah.
Because it weighs so heavily towards what has been seen near you before. Whereas the LEPS app, I think, maybe just doesn't worry about that as much. That's not as important to their algorithm. And so if you match something visually, it'll give you that suggestion. So I use that kind of as a cross-reference when I'm trying to make identifications, upload my photos there. I also have a Flickr account that I put my best quality photographs. I have an Instagram account that I've been using more regularly. I've been trying to post once a day, mostly moths, sometimes birds. And
oh, yeah. Do you want to tell people what your Instagram account?
My Instagram handle is Zach DuFran. So it's ZDUFRAN. And I post mostly moths, but also birds, sometimes plants, and some other nature-related things that I'm interested in.
What I really like about iNaturalist now, and in addition to how the AI has really been improved over the last couple years, but also you have the community of experts that are using the app and helping you, or using the platform actually, and helping you identify things. So there are people all over the world who are experts in whatever, and they will come in and verify your observation. Is there something like that for the LEP app that you have?
Fortunately, that's not part of the LEPS app. And you're right. That's a wonderful aspect of iNaturalist. I really like it for that reason. I can help others identify things, and I get help from experts. And I've made some connections with experts actually doing research in Lepidoptera, and I can ask them questions. And the ones that are on iNaturalist are usually really helpful and interested and, willing to answer questions. And
right. If they're on iNaturalist, they want to engage with you.
Right.
iNaturalist has been just getting better and better every year, and I'm really excited to continue using it for the BioBlitz events, especially now that, everything is still uncertain about how big groups can be. We may still have some sort of virtual component to our next year, and iNaturalist is just a really fantastic tool for us to use. So you use those two apps. Do you ever use any kind of field journal or handwrite things?
Not really. I started writing things down, and I just found that it was, with the number of species I'll see on a normal night, it was too much to try to keep up with. On my moth nights that I do out by Thunderbird, I do keep a list on my phone, like as I'm going that night. And I started doing that last year, I think. And that has been kind of enlightening to me to see the number of species we'll get on a night, and how that varies throughout the year. There's definitely this like bell curve. Starting in April, the numbers are kind of low. And then they start climbing really quickly in May and June. It stays pretty high and almost plateaued during those warmest months of the year. And then it starts to fall off pretty quick again when cold fronts start coming through in the fall. So that's been interesting to see. I haven't plotted that out, but I can see it pretty clearly in my head from the list that I've been keeping. I've started pulling some data out of iNaturalist. There is an official Lepidoptera list for the state of Oklahoma that has each species listed and which counties they've been seen in. I've been trying to combine that list with what's been seen on iNaturalist. That official list has a lot of gaps in it because it's really just what has been reported to the official record keeper. A lot of counties haven't had many observations. So since I've got some software experience, and that's what I do as my day job, I've been trying to combine those two lists together, and I'm working on creating a map of Oklahoma that has the species counts for each county. That will be, I think, really revealing as to where there have been few observations and where we can take some field trips to kind of fill those in.
iNaturalist has been an official source now. Even some big organizations are starting to use it for all sorts of database purposes, and the observations made and collected in that database are now put into official records. So it's not just a casual thing anymore. People are really utilizing it for official purposes.
Right. It's lauded as a citizen science tool, and I use it pretty much from I guess you could say, a selfish standpoint. It's my kind of repository of my nature observations. But I've actually been contacted, I think, 2 or 3 different times from someone that's, writing a paper that's going to be in a refereed science journal and asking if they could use one of my photos because it had some significance. One time I photographed a mosquito on one of my tropical plants that I had in my greenhouse on the flower. And for some reason, this mosquito on this plant was useful for a scientific paper. So I'm like, sure, of course you can use it. I'd be happy for my photo to be in a refereed journal article.
Well, and even during our BioBlitz events, our botanist, Amy, has noticed citizen scientists posting some plant observations of things that were new to the state, exotic things that have come in new to the state, and records of things that have been observed during BioBlitz and outside of BioBlitz that are some of our rare species. So these new observations by people who are out and about are really important, especially considering survey work for myself is there's very little money and there's not very much time to make that part of our job to go out and do surveys. And it's hard to cover as much ground as the citizen scientists, especially during these events that we kind of provide incentives to get out there. Even this summer, you got together with a small group of friends to continue your moth night. And it sounds like you probably converted some people to being moth enthusiasts. How many people do you think you have made additional citizen science experts?
Well, we've had probably over the couple of years that I've been doing it, probably 40 people or so that have come out for a moth night at the chapel. There's a small group of us that are there regularly. So I've got my 2 closest moth buddies, Rick and Leah, that are there every time. There's a lot of birders. Birding is like a long established pastime and naturalist activity. Looking at the birding group is a good place to recruit mothers. I've had several people that have come to moth nights that are also birders, maybe birders first, but moths are interesting to them. It's kind of exciting. Like if you're a birder, when you get a species you haven't seen before for the first time, it's called a lifer. You can bird for a couple of years and then you don't really see many lifers anymore in your local area. It's kind of rare to see a lifer after you've been birding for a few years in your neighborhood. But with moths, it's completely different. There's so many species that you can get lifers, for many years. There's such diversity that the number of species is just incredible. So that excitement that you get from seeing a new species for the first time happens more frequently. Usually when you see a species you haven't seen before, you're at least aware of it. You'd seen other people's pictures of it, you had read about it. And with moths, lots of times you see something and you have no idea what it is when you're seeing it for the first time, just because they're less well studied and everything.
Yeah, moths being less well studied, certainly as compared to birds, you are much more likely to contribute lots of important new data. So birders, like you said, most of the things have been seen. There's very few new observations. Oh, you and I actually went out to that whooping crane sighting out at Lake Thunderbird the other day. Whooping cranes have been seen in in Cleveland County only twice on record, and we were there for the second time. That's a really rare occasion that you see something that hasn't been seen in your location. But with moths, it sounds like, every time you go out, you're potentially finding something that nobody's ever recorded for the county.
Right. It's exciting for the county or for the state. There's been a lot of times we've recorded at least the first iNaturalist sighting for the state when we're out at our moth nights. And sometimes their new records for the state. So I keep in touch with John Fisher, who keeps the Oklahoma records for Lepidoptera, and get him to confirm anything that was not on his list that I've seen. Those are significant findings, and it's fun to realize that just something that was a hobby and fun for you to go out and be looking at is actually scientifically significant too.
Yeah, and for those BioBlitzers listening in who want to contribute new and valuable data, you just have to choose a group of organisms that isn't well studied. So choose some group of insects, or choose I'm trying to think of something else. Insects are one of the biggest groups we have that people could start doing observations on, and almost certainly you're going to make some significant contributions to range or population or something like that, because so little has been done. And now with big databases, and people are able to cross-reference databases so easily, all that information can be used by people around the world for research.
Yeah, definitely. I think lichens are another group of organisms that have maybe not received as much attention. There's so much of Oklahoma. There's so many different ecological regions that I'm sure there's variation across the state. I know that I got to go on the lichen walk during this last BioBlitz with Sheila Strawn and learned a lot from her, but I know she hasn't covered as much ground in Oklahoma as an individual can't cover everything. So I'm sure there's room for new discoveries in that field as well.
Oh, for sure. She is one person in the state who is an expert, and maybe there are 2 or 3 other people who know how to identify lichens in the state. Compared to the number of birders, it's a very small number of people who know how to identify lichens. What's something new that you are looking forward to learning about moths, or excited about moths right now? Are you thinking about traveling to new areas to see new species? Have you gotten some cool new books that you have been learning from?
I did just read a book. I got it last year, but I have a huge to-read pile and just kind of got to it recently. It's called Moths, A Complete Guide to Biology and Behavior. It's not a field guide, almost like a biology textbook, but it's specific to moths. And I learned a tremendous amount from it. There's a lot of information in there that's kind of the superlative species, things that are really interesting, have, kind of weird biology or really beautiful. I just learned a lot about moths in that book. And you mentioned exploring new areas. Yeah, I've mainly done my moth observations here in central Oklahoma. I also go down near Lake Texoma on a regular basis. And so I've done quite a bit of moth observations down there. And then I've had a couple of moth nights I've set up in different parts of the state. So last year we went to Quartz Mountain during National Moth Week. And we also went to Tulsa during National Moth Week. And then this year, I went down to southeastern Oklahoma around Broken Bow and did a moth night down there. But I want to hit different parts of the state. I've been trying to kind of go towards the corners, and I haven't been up to Black Mesa yet. So I would love to do a moth night up there. I would love around Woodward area. There's just not a lot of moth observations in those areas. And so I think would be pretty easy for us to find some species that hadn't been seen in the state before.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that our BioBlitz at Black Mesa was a pretty chilly BioBlitz. The moth observations during that weekend probably weren't ideal. What has been one of your most memorable moth nights?
I'll mention 2. Both exciting because I was out of my normal area, and so I was seeing a lot of species that I hadn't seen here. Last year when we went to Quartz Mountain, my goal was to try to see some kind of Western species, because there's so much ecological variation from the Western, especially Northwestern, but from west to east across our state. Moths are so closely tied to plants, they're host plants, that whenever there's rainfall variation across the state and you have different types of plants growing in different areas, you're going to see different species of moths. So even though, Oklahoma is not a huge state, we've got a lot of diversity here. So when we went to Quartz Mountain last year, I was hoping that maybe we would see some Western species, and we did. I think we saw about 5 species that do not range into central Oklahoma. There are more Western species that you would see in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, California, and so on.
Oh, wow.
That we got down at Quartz Mountain. And then whenever we went down to southeast Oklahoma this year, there's a lot of species of moths that are in the southeastern part of the country. Florida up to, I would say, up to Arkansas, and they don't quite get into Oklahoma, or they just barely get into Oklahoma. And we got some of those species on that moth night earlier this year. So that was fun.
I was curious about the geographic range, and then it makes total sense that they would change across the state as the vegetation changes because they're tied to their host plants.
Right. There's also some species that are Central Plains kind of specialists, I guess you would say. You know, their host plants are plants that you would find on prairies in the Central Plains. And so they range from Texas up through Oklahoma. And some of those we have kind of like the northernmost records for those species, which is neat.
So you got started studying moths and doing BioBlitz during that 2017 virtual spring BioBlitz we had in April, but you must have had some interest in biology and natural history before that, or you wouldn't have participated. You're a radar computer scientist guy. How did you get interested in doing more natural history exploration? Has it been something you've been really interested in as a kid, like always being outside?
Yeah, definitely. I've always loved nature. I have lots of childhood memories outdoor exploring in the backyard and other places. I remember, building little habitats for turtles in my backyard. Some of my most vivid childhood memories are being outdoors and in nature and experiencing certain animals for the first time. I even have a first moth memory, which is kind of crazy. I was just thinking about this when I was reading Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods. And I was kind of reflecting on my childhood. And I remember we had this ping pong table on our back porch that folded up vertically to be stored. And it sat underneath our porch light on the back porch. One day we were pulling it out to play ping pong, and there was a big sphinx moth that was kind of sandwiched between the table, and it was dead. And I was just like, wow, this thing is big. And I didn't know this thing existed. And I remember noticing its big eyeballs and its big proboscis that was curled up in front of its mouth. I wasn't hooked on moths at the age of 5 after seeing that or anything. I do remember seeing that and it making an impression, it being, interesting to me. And then as I was going through school and everything, I was really interested in music. I decided to study meteorology because we had a good school for it here at OU, and I was strong in math and science. And I was like, well, that makes sense to study that. But I've always kind of had nature hobbies and started growing a lot of plants when I was in graduate school, built a greenhouse, interested in the biology and botany and horticulture. And then I got interested in birding a few years before I started doing moths. So I've just always kind of got a new little obsession or niche that I'm trying to learn about, I guess. And moths has kind of taken over for now.
Well, I'm glad to hear I'm not the only one that gets distracted by new and fun things to learn about and do. I have way too many hobbies. I have to keep a list of ones that I won't ever do, so my husband at least feels like my life won't be taken over by my hobbies.
I can relate.
Okay, now we're on to the quick question round. You grew up in Oklahoma, and you grew up in Norman, right?
That's right.
So you've been exploring Oklahoma your whole life. What is your favorite place to go to in Oklahoma to be outside?
I really like the Wichita Mountains a lot. It's a beautiful area and it's biologically significant. There's neat birds that show up there that we don't have elsewhere in the state, neat plants. It's just a great place to go camping and kind of exploring with my kids and wife.
Yes, it's a fantastic place. When I moved to Oklahoma over 20 years ago, that was the first kind of natural area that I visited. And it was overwhelming how beautiful it was. And I had no idea something like that would exist in Oklahoma when I first moved here. I don't know how much you've traveled or seen, so I was curious on what kind of natural history bucket list item you might have. Do you have a place that you're interested in going? Something you're interested in seeing in the wild?
Well, I have been fortunate in that I've gotten to travel internationally quite a bit. With my last job that I had, I was working on some of our international projects. And so I got to travel to the Middle East, to Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. And I got to travel quite a bit in Southeast Asia, Indonesia several times, Thailand a couple of times, the Philippines. Unfortunately, I wasn't interested in birding during that whole period, just
Oh
during part of
no.
it, and I wasn't interested in moths yet. And also I was, my time there was pretty work centric. I have had some opportunities to do nature observation in Thailand and in Ethiopia just last year. I got to see a lot of species of birds there, and that was pretty incredible just on a family vacation.
Probably doubled your life list.
Yeah, it was a significant increase. I would really like to spend some time in the tropics, whether that's in Central or South America or in Southeast Asia, actually doing some moth nights. And there's some good like eco lodges where they kind of cater to birding groups and things, but they will actually set up lights and sheets at night to bring in insects so that in the morning there will be birds there eating at the buffet. And
oh my.
there are moth people that go to those places and take advantage of those lights at night. They just have a huge number of species that will show up in, a tropical rainforest. So that would be quite a bucket list for me to get to go see one of those moth nights.
Those tropical areas, I just think of the huge amount of insect diversity that's there. I mean, they're still finding species left and right of insects in those kinds of locations. Yeah, that would be super exciting.
Yeah, I'm on some Facebook groups for moth enthusiasts. People will post pictures from those tropical locations and no one has any idea what they are. They're like, well, it's in this family. Good luck. It probably hasn't been published yet.
Right.
That's pretty exciting.
So what has been the most exciting organism that you've seen in the wild?
Oh, tough question.
It doesn't have to be a moth either.
So I will pick a moth. I'm going to just think of one recent that was exciting. Earlier this spring, just for fun, I was kind of looking at all of the different species on iNaturalist that I hadn't seen within the state of Oklahoma. And I made a list of top 10 most wanted moths, cool moths that I hadn't seen in Oklahoma. And I was sharing it with my closest moth friends, saying, these are my targets for this year. Let's see if I can find any of them. And in September at my porch light, I didn't even put any effort in. A Tursa Sphinx showed up, and it's a really cool, Sphinx moths are generally larger moths. It's really sleek looking. It has big eyes. The wings they almost look like wood grain and have this really elegant shape, pointed, and almost looks like a stealth bomber or something. But it was a really pretty moth. That was one of my top 10 that I was able to see this year. So that was cool.
Oh, good. So what advice would you give to someone wanting to become an expert in moths?
Well, it's really easy to get started. You don't have to have any special equipment or go out to some special location. You can just turn on your porch light like I did, come back and check it 30 minutes later. If you don't mind staying up late, you'll see more things, or leave it on overnight and check it in the morning. Using iNaturalist or Bug Guide, you can start getting a feel for how to identify things and pin them down to a family so that you can slowly narrow down the number of possible species to figure out what you've seen.
Do you keep a collection?
I don't collect, although I have been contacted by some researchers, asked me to collect some. I have collected for them. There's somebody in Colorado that is interested in noctuids. So I've collected some that seem significant, that aren't just things I see all the time, but if they seem unusual, possibly out of range, I'll make a collection for that person. And then there's another guy that lives in Rhode Island that is interested in some of the obscure, less studied micromoths, these really tiny moths. And so I've been trying to collect some of those for him whenever I see them. And lots of times they're those ones that we can never quite pin down the ID on. We kind of figure out it's in this subfamily, but can't get any farther. And so I've collected some of those for him.
No, I was curious because a lot of insects groups, you have to have an organism in hand and look at super minute details to get down to species. But for moths, you find that the pictures that you take usually are sufficient to easily identify them. Well, I don't mean easily, but are able to identify them?
Most of the time, yes. There's two species of Desmia moths that we see out at our moth nights on a regular basis. And we know there's a trick to it. You have to catch it and look at the underside. And if it's mostly white, it's funeralis. And if it's got more black bands, then it's maculalis. So there's a couple of like little tricks like that. And then there's this, the banded tussock moth and the sycamore tussock moth. You can't tell just by looking at them. They're identical as moths, but the caterpillars are distinct and easy to tell apart.
Oh, ha.
If you had the adult moth in hand, you could look at the genitalia under a microscope and tell the difference, but otherwise you're not going to be able to tell the difference. So there's a couple that I just kind of write off and I say, well, it's one of those two species. It doesn't bother me that I don't know this time which one it is or not.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of micro moths that are kind of in that category that are really hard, but it's a smaller group of them. For the most part, photos are going to be good enough to help identify. Sometimes we try to get the moth to open up and show its underwing, which is a lot of times hidden, because those can be helpful for identification. So we'll try to coax a moth into showing its underwings and get a picture of that. That helps identify some of the moths.
I just learned about micromoths in the last couple years, and I didn't realize how important a group it was and what they really were. I guess a lot of the caterpillars or the larval stage, I don't even know if they're considered caterpillars, are leaf miners, patterns in leaves. And some of the times you can tell what species they are by the pattern they leave in the leaf.
Yeah, that's right.
I've just learned a teeny bit about that.
We had a guy, Michael Palmer, that was at OSU.
Right.
He moved to Oregon, I think, recently, or Washington recently, but he knew a lot about the leaf miners, and he came to one of our moth nights in Norman, and I talked to him about it. And yeah, I don't know as much about those either, but sometimes just knowing the species of tree that they're leaf mining narrows it down to one or two species of leaf miner moths. Yeah, so there's interesting biology of the leaf miners. There's also leaf folders, leaf curlers, interesting ways that those caterpillars are either kind of like protecting themselves or disguising themselves when they're in that vulnerable stage of growth.
He was even able, on his property in Stillwater before he moved away, he was able to find species new to science outside of Stillwater, Oklahoma, because he was looking at these Microlepidoptera. I was super impressed at his patience in trying to tease out these little bitty species and learn a whole nother group of organisms, because he's trained as an ecologist and botanist.
Yeah, and he takes some excellent pictures of those tiny moths and those tiny insects. So I've been very impressed seeing his stuff. It's awesome.
Most of us are always trying to learn something new, take on new hobbies, take on new activities, even professionally. Like I've started this podcast. What's the next new thing you want to learn about? It doesn't have to be biology related.
I'm trying to grow more native plants in my yard, which I think is important because of loss of habitat for all of our native critters. And that includes moths, but it's not my, only motivation for doing that. But so I'm interested in native plants and kind of like growing a little bit of a prairie in my front yard. I've been slowly increasing the size of my pollinator garden.
Yay!
Unfortunately, I got interested in the Oklahoma Master Naturalist program just before, COVID came along. And so that's kind of put a halt on my trainings and things, but I wanting to pursue that Oklahoma Master Naturalist accreditation. I spend lots of time doing nature activities and things anyway, so it's easy for me to get like my volunteer hours in for that. But I really enjoy the training courses that are offered through that program, and I think having that group of nature-minded people to kind of spend time with has been fun. I'm looking forward to that whenever it resumes, whether that's when we get to a new normal with COVID or if they start doing that virtually. I'm not sure where that's going, but I'm looking forward to doing that again.
Oh, yeah, that would be nice if they were able to get back started, at least maybe meet up and have webinars or continue education online for a little bit. Well, that wraps up the questions I have. Is there anything you would like to add about yourself or moths?
Oh, well, if anyone is interested in experiencing a moth night, just even one time, I would love to have them come join me in Norman sometime. We'll socially distance, we'll wear masks and all that good stuff. It would be great to hear from other people and have other people join us that are interested in kind of learning a little bit more or just seeing some interesting moths show up. I'm sure, you would see some new things if you came, if you hadn't, well, even if you had spent times looking at moths before, there's always something new to see.
So how would people get involved? Should they email you?
Yeah, they could email me or message me on iNaturalist or on Instagram, or I'm Z DuFran pretty much every place. I'm zdufran@gmail.com or Z DuFran on Instagram. I'm Z DuFran on iNaturalist, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody and welcome anyone to one of our moth nights.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Zach, so much for offering that to people. And thank you so much for joining me on our new podcast. I'm excited to see more moths and learn a little bit more about moths myself. I am trying to learn more about pollinators. Some groups of moths can be good pollinators in our pollinator habitats. There's so many more moths out there, and they do so much in our world. I'm excited that you have joined the moth group and are now learning so much about it and contributing so much data about our moths and our moth diversity in the state. And I'm super excited that it was because of your participation in our virtual BioBlitz. That's probably one of the most heartwarming stories I've heard about BioBlitz since I began working on the project. That's exciting.
Well, thanks. Yeah, it was fun talking to you today. So thank you for reaching out to me.
Of course. And thanks to everyone who listened to our new BioBlitz Oklahoma podcast. We have more Meet the Expert episodes lined up for you in the coming new year. I'm excited to announce that our next episode will be our first Ask the Expert episode. Angelina Stancambiano, my BioBlitz co-coordinator, and I will be chatting with Adam Ryburn, a botanist at Oklahoma City University. We will be chatting about plants that are important to our winter holidays. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen so that you are notified when we upload that first Ask the Expert episode. You can also stay up to date on our Facebook page, BioBlitz Oklahoma, and on Twitter at OKBioBlitz, and of course on our website, biosurvey.ou.edu/BioBlitzOK. Thanks again to Zach DuFran for joining me on Meet the Experts. I'm so impressed with the expertise he has been able to cultivate in just a few years, and good luck to him as he looks for his 1,000th Oklahoma moth species. This podcast is a project of BioBlitz Oklahoma, an outreach program of the Oklahoma Biological Survey at the University of Oklahoma. We hope that you have time to step outside today and explore Oklahoma's amazing biodiversity. Remember, you can find biodiversity right outside your own door.